Football Game Plan Scout Team. David Hassagen here with the czar of the playbook, Emery Hunt, and it's time to continue to keep you informed ahead of the NFL Draft. And Emery, you've been extremely busy doing just that. Tell us about your draft guide.
Well, you can buy the draft guide at footballgameplan.com/2020 draft guide. It's featuring over 650 prospects, NFL prospects, some Canadian prospects thrown in there. So we go top to bottom, full-fledged scouting reports on every player in there, not just a list, but every player has an individual scouting profile, over 780 pages of content. Get yours today.
And I'll tell you what, I had to download that, so I know exactly how many pages in there, but it's actually created by somebody who actually looks at the tape themselves instead of getting some interns to do it for them. So
right. I'll watch every game, and we break down what goes into it. 3 games per prospect, their best game, their worst game, the best possible matchup or most intriguing matchup, and then we formulate the grade based off that.
So it's a nice, refreshing perspective. But back to the show, and this week we will be breaking down the wide receiver position. Henry Ruggs III, CeeDee Lamb, Jerry Jeudy, KJ Hamler. This wide receiver position this year is extremely deep. We could see a lot of guys going in the first round.
Yeah, and you look at how I graded these guys, and you look at that juxtaposed to last year. Last year I may have had, I think, 5 or 6 guys in the 80s. This year I have 10 or 11. So this shows you how great it is at the top. But you're right, it's a deep class. So if you don't get one of these guys early, later on in the draft, mid-rounds, you can find receivers. But we know the draft tends to have a lot of runs. You may get a run on quarterbacks early. I think this class, you're going to get a run on offensive tackles throughout the first round. So that may put some great receivers in rounds 2 and 3.
I was about to say you could see a lot of receivers going just throughout the draft that could have been a first or second day talent, maybe even going down to the 4th round, depending on how things go. It'll be interesting to take a look at that as we go forward. But for the fans now that downloaded the draft guide, and you should be doing that now, there just might be some confusion because you don't just have one wide receiver section. You've got 4 wide receiver sections. You've got split ends, slot receivers, flankers, and inside receivers. So for those of us, still learning about the game, maybe not as familiar with these different positions, can you break those down for us? How do all these 4 receiver positions differ from each other?
Well, it's been a pet peeve of mine because you can't ask Steve Smith to do the same thing Randy Moss does, right? They play 2 different positions. You can't ask Wes Welker to do the same things Megatron would have done because they play 2 different positions. So why would you rank receivers 1 through whatever as one group when they play different positions? So that's why I broke it up into what you're going to see out there actually on the field. So your split ends are your X receivers. They're mostly aligned away from the tight end by themselves. That's your number 1 guy. That's your bona fide go-to. That's your A.J. Greens. That's your Megatrons. That's your Randy Mosses, those guys. Now, a lot of guys can play multiple positions, and you'll see that in the draft guide that guys can play multiple positions. But primarily, your split end is your X, your number 1 receiver. That's your go-to guy. That's your more polished guy. Your slot receiver, everybody knows what a slot receiver is.
Your typical Wes Welker,
Amendola. A lot of those guys that can really get in and out of their breaks pretty quickly. But you also have some bigger guys that do a great job inside in the slot, too. So don't just relegate the slot receiver to a shorter, quicker receiver. You can have a taller, quicker receiver, like one of the guys we're going to talk about later in this segment that fits the mold of a taller, quicker slot receiver. So it's about how well you read coverage on the fly, how quick you can get in and out of your breaks, and how decisive you can be in breaking down zone coverages and then making things happen after the catch. So those are usually your money guys you try to find on 3rd and short, 3rd and medium to win that individual matchup. They're a lot quicker than guys on the outside. Your flanker, that's your explosive athlete. That's the one that's your Z receiver. So let's say like your Jerry Rice would be a great flanker, a guy you put in motion. He can play X or Z, but as a Z, put him in motion, he's already on the move. He's going to exploit those matchups. He's off the line of scrimmage, so he's on the same side as your tight end. You want a more dynamic athlete, a faster guy.
More of a game breaker than a guy who's going to be catching 4.
Right.
You're not going to get 10 receptions out of this guy. You're going to get 4, 5, or 6, but they're all going to be big plays.
Think of Will Fuller, who plays for the Houston Texans, who seems like he only catches touchdowns. That's your Z. Now, your inside receiver, that's your bigger guy and I don't want to say it like this because it's going to sound cruel, but it's a guy that's probably 2 burgers away from being a tight end anyway. But it's a bigger inside guy.
Right.
Primarily, let's say Marcus Colston.
Okay.
Slot guy, but played inside, kind of like a tight X, if you want to call it. It has a tighter split to the line of scrimmage, but he's also a guy that does a great job in reading coverages on the fly. He can break down defenses over the middle of the field. It's not necessarily a tight end, but is a really good receiver on the inside that you don't want to put on the outside. Maybe doesn't have that explosive speed as your outside guys do, but has savvy to play inside, has good route running skills. That's your bigger inside guys. So you're going to see a lot of bigger guys fit the mold of playing the inside receiver in my rankings.
Now, the biggest question is, obviously, NFL teams are going to be breaking this down like you are. Which position of the four do you think is the deepest of this wide receiver class? Because, again, we've talked about it. We could see 10 or 11 wide receivers potentially get first-round grades or early seconds. Is there one position over the others that you're saying, wow, there's a lot of talent here?
Well, that's a great question. I would say because of what we're seeing in college football, there's always going to be a sheer number of slot receivers.
Right.
You know, because everyone is running 4 wide. Some teams are going empty, so you got 5 wide receivers out there. So you're going to always get a bevy of slot guys at your disposal. I just think with the way college football is, the savviness that we're seeing with these receivers is impressive. So whether you have a split end, slot, flanker, or inside guy, you're going to always find a lot. I just think this year you see more receivers that are quality than ever before.
And we'll certainly keep an eye on that. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the top 5 at all 4 wide receiver positions when we return on Football Game Plan Scout Team right here on the Game Plus Network.
Football Game Plan is brought to you in part by Ninth and Lux. Visit the website ninethandlux.com and check out the clothing gallery. Do You Music with featured artist IW in his latest album, Season 2. You can check that out on iTunes as well as doyoumusic.com. Nesby Phipps, art, life, entertainment. NesbyPhipps.com. Grind It Out Fitness. Visit the website grinditoutfitness.com and download the app. Be sure to order your copy of the Go-Go Offense by Coach Brennan Marion on footballgameplan.com/GoGoOffense. Coach Marion goes through the ins and outs of his explosive offense, one that's tearing up the college football field and putting a lot of points on the scoreboard. Again, you can order your copy at footballgameplan.com/GoGoOffense.
Welcome back, football fans. We've broken down what all the sub-positions in the wide receiver position mean. Now it's time to look at the top prospects in each. And we're going to start with the split ends. A couple familiar names, but a couple smaller D1 programs here as well, Emery. How did you break down your top 5?
Well, number 1, obviously, as we look at the top 5 here, number 1 is Henry Ruggs III. I think he's just explosive. He's what you want in a game breaker that also happens to play on the X side. So I love his ability as a total receiver. 4.2 something speed, 4.3 speed, whatever he ran at the combine, but he plays that way as well. So he was clear cut for me, the number 1. But when you look at Isaiah Coulter out of Rhode Island, there's 3 Rhode Island receivers in this draft class that are tremendous. Amir Dorsey is the slot guy, and you have his cousin, Aaron Parker, who's also a split receiver as you look at the rest of the rankings. But when you look at Isaiah Coulter, and I spoke with him at the combine, he reminds me a lot athletically of A.J. Green and how A.J. Green can get in and out of his cuts, kind of like use that slender frame to slice in between a corner and keep it skinny to where he's not running into the safety. He's a great point of attack player as far as when the ball is there at the catch point, he's able to go up and get it and wrestle it away from a defender. He's also able to use that athleticism to pull away if need be. He's a total type package receiver. Big game against Virginia Tech that really showed that he can play against the top competition. And what's interesting about him is that he's an early entry. So he declared, and which is rare for an FCS guy to declare early. We talked about that in the running backs video with Pete Guerrero out of Monmouth. You don't see that often. So for him to declare and also get a combine invite shows that the NFL was already high on him coming out.
And you are right, proving that just because you don't have a great record doesn't mean you don't have good players. You got 3 of them coming out of the Rams.
3 receivers and a 4th O-lineman and Kyle Murphy, a guard that played in the East-West Shrine Bowl. So a lot of talent. Shout out to head coach Jim Fleming for what he was been able to do up there at Rhode Island.
Don't sleep on the CAA, folks. Next, let's get into the flankers. And these are the guys that most fans will be familiar with this group, starting with C.D. Lamb from Oklahoma at the top. Obviously, this guy's been making big plays for the last couple of years in his college career. He's at the top for a reason.
Yeah, he's at the top, man. You talk about a guy that is aggressive after the catch. He wants to score the ball. And I like that about him because you need your flanker to be a game breaker. We talked about that earlier in the first segment where you get the ball in their hands, they know what to do with it. He's a guy that, whether it's short, intermediate, or deep down the field, he is looking to score every time he touches the football. That's the type of player that you want playing a position. And you look at some other flankers. You talk about explosive game breakers. How about we talk about Menashe Bailey down there at Morgan State? No one knows about him, but I've broadcasted a bunch of Morgan State games over the course of the last 4 years. This was a guy that came into Morgan State as a linebacker, only 1 year of playing high school football, came in as a linebacker, made the transition to wide receiver, and became one of the top receivers in the MEAC. And you look at what makes him special: explosive speed. A guy that could take a short pass a long way. He plays on all special teams. So when you look at a guy that can play right away in the NFL, he plays on kick coverage, punt coverage. He blocked 3 kicks, brought 1 back for a touchdown. And also, he's still developing and growing as a receiver. He's one of the more underrated players in this draft class. Tremendous talent, who was also one of the MVPs down at the Tropical Bowl this past January, an all-star event where he just looked faster than everybody else.
It'll be interesting to keep an eye on the flanker position in this draft class. Next, we go into the slot receivers, and this might be the deepest position of the 4 in terms of the play now quality. Not only guys with like Judy, Hamler, but also another FCS guy makes this list in Ernest Edwards.
Yeah, out of Maine, tremendous talent, very good slot receiver. He played on the outside at Maine, but he's going to transition to be more of a slot in the NFL. He projects to be a slot receiver, in my opinion. But you talk about slant guy, catch and run, that's him all day. And that's the type of guy you want on the inside, who can make those quick moves to really put a safety or a slot corner in a bind. Now, he's going to match up well with these slot corners because they can match that quickness, but his explosiveness after the catch, when you look at what he brings to the table, along with KJ Hamler, along with Lynn Bowden out of Kentucky, another one of these guys that are just fluid with the ball, that can weave their way in and out of traffic. They're great receivers, and those are the type of players you want on the inside. Ernest Edwards' tape was clean. It was excellent. Coming from the FCS, another CAA guy, big-time competition, played bigger in the big games. I thought he had a really good game against Jacksonville State last year in the playoffs. I'm a big fan of what he brings to the table.
And Ernest Edwards will let you know where he is on the field at all times during the course of a game. But let's talk about Jerry Jeudy, though, real quick. He's at the top of your list here for this position out of Alabama. We talked a lot about the Alabama wide receivers maybe being the best group ever. Jerry Jeudy was a huge part of that.
Love Jerry Jeudy and what he brings to the table because he's elusive. He's also explosive, too. He has the moves to make you miss in the phone booth. That's the guy you want on the inside. So he can catch that short pass, quickly turn around, make you miss, and then explode down the field. So you want those type of receivers on the inside, which is why people talked about Alabama's receiving corps being one of the best ever. We joked about that on our college football show because of how vast history is. But when you look at Ruggs, you look at what
Jeudy brings
to the table. You see what happens when you have explosive talent out there, and we're going to get another one next year in Smith, who went back for his senior season at Alabama. So I like Jeudy. I think he does a great job after the catch. Big fan of what he brings to the table as well.
And let's get into the last position inside the receivers. That's the inside receivers themselves. Key part to any NFL successful offense. A lot of height in this group, and Brian Edwards out of South Carolina leads the group.
Yeah, people talk about Edwards as if he's not dynamic. He's a big receiver that can also run. He may not run forward too, but he's not slow. A lot of times on film, you saw him run away from defenders at South Carolina. I like how he plays. He reminds me of James Jones, who played with the Green Bay Packers and Oakland Raiders, now Las Vegas Raiders, but they were Los Angeles at one point in time. Exactly. So they've been all over the place. But you look at what he brings to the table, big fan of what he does over the middle of the field after the catch. He's a bigger inside guy that can play that physical game over the middle of the field. So you like that aspect about it. But look at 2 FCS guys, or 1 FCS guy and a Division II guy. Shane Zylstra out of Minnesota State got better every year. Tremendous talent coming from that Mavericks program. Love what he did out there on the field. Played big time in that Division II National Championship game against West Florida. And Kyle Anthony out of Howard. Again, been on the broadcast for a lot of the Howard games over his career. Was on his first game as a freshman against Morgan State. He stepped up big then. Very comfortable in catching the ball away from his body. You like how he's able to play well without the ball. He blocks, he runs good routes. He also had another really good week of work down at the Tropical Bowl. Again, him and Menashe Bailey, 2 guys coming from HBCU programs that are stepping up big and making themselves into bigger pro prospects who will also be down at the HBCU Combine down there in Miami later on this month.
Certainly going to be a deep group of receivers to talk about. But when we return, we'll get our opinions of our football game plan contributor, Troy Anthony, on what his thoughts are on Emory's rankings right here on Football Game Plan Scout Team.
Football Game Plan is brought to you in part by Financial Coaching LLC, investment, retirement security. Stewardship Credit. Financial growth is in your hands. Stewardshipcredit.com. Adrienne Marie Photo, photographer, writer, management. AdrienneMariePhotography.com. Lock Multimedia. Welcome back to Football Game Plan Scout Team here on the Game Plus Network. Emory Hunt, Anthony Troy. I know you have some issues with my rankings, as most people do, but if you want to check out those full rankings, once again, go to footballgameplan.com/2020 draft guide to pick up your copy of the draft guide. Today, you had an opportunity to go through the draft guide, to go through my receiver rankings, and I'm here to go back and forth. Normally, Alex is here going back and forth, and I'm away watching you guys do your thing. Now I'm here. Which one of the issues you have with the rankings?
Now, my biggest thing would be, I think that Jerry Jeudy is the #1 receiver in this draft, hands down. But in your rankings, you have Ruggs 1.5 points ahead of Jerry Jeudy. How so?
Ruggs, to me, is more explosive, and I think he's a little bit stronger. Jeudy is the jitterbug, but Jeudy worries me a little bit because of his slender frame. And I know size is not a skill, but when you look at Ruggs, I think Ruggs just plays a tougher, more physical game, which is tailor-made to what he does out there on film. And I think Ruggs does a better job in setting up his routes, catching at the catch point, making stronger catches, and being a little bit more explosive than Jeudy. So Jeudy is a great player, which is why he graded out #1 in the flanker rankings or slot rankings. But Ruggs, to me, is just a more polished guy at this point.
And another thing I noticed is that CeeDee Lamb is about 5 or 6 points less than Jerry Jeudy. And I think CeeDee Lamb is going to be right there in the top 3 mix. Why is he so many points behind Jeudy in this one?
It's explosiveness. That's what it all comes down to, the explosiveness or the true overall athleticism. Now, he's a good player. Talked about in the last segment with Dave that he's a guy that when he catches the football, he's looking to score the ball. You want receivers like that on your team. But when you look at him, he's my #1 flanker. When you look at him juxtaposed to Ruggs or even Jerry Jeudy from an athleticism standpoint, when you factor in speed, explosiveness, agility, it's hard to give him those points when those guys are clearly more dynamic, more explosive. So in no sense, you can do more with those guys because if it comes down to everybody's equal, teams tend to separate them from the athleticism part. That's why the combine is technically important, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because if it's even, okay, who's a better athlete? Who's faster, who gives you a little bit more in what you can do. So that's why he's so many points behind him. Not necessarily because he's not good. It's just that when you factor in those guys' speed, explosiveness, agility, athleticism, that pushes their points up a little bit higher.
Now, I see that a guy like Pittman is ranked around, you have him ranked at a number like 73, but yet he's your #1.
No, he's actually that was a graphical error by our producer, Mike McCarthy, but he's actually in the 80s, so he was number
so you do have him up
I
there.
have him high.
Because
you looked at how it was ranked where he's 73 and everybody around him is in the 80s.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was a graphical error. Mike McCarthy, our producer. But it was funny about Pittman going into, now this is why I love the process, because the first time I got exposed to Pittman was down at you watched games throughout the year, but live was at the Senior Bowl. I didn't think he had the best week. And so had I just relied on that, and that was the initial take, I would have missed how good of a receiver he is. So that's why when I go back and watch the film, I factor in everything that I've seen. So when I watch the film, I'm like, yo, this dude really can ball. He's big time as far as game situations. When you talk about, man, it's 3rd and 8, we need a play. You go to Michael Pittman, and he's able to get open, make a catch, and get down the field. And I hate to throw comparisons out there, but when you watch the style of play he does and how big he was on big downs, it's Juju Smith-Schuster-like. He's a burly guy like his dad, and he's able to do things after the catch, but he's always able to find himself getting open, inside or outside.
Now, Bailey, you have him ranked with an 80. Is that because he's so versatile in what he can do as going for on blocking kicks and special teams and everything else, or do you see him becoming could be a dominant receiver in the game?
I like Menashe Bailey, and the reason why is because of all of those things you mentioned, but also because of the things that he has gotten better at doing over the course of the seasons. You talk about last year, let's say his junior season, he was a good receiver. Now, their passing game wasn't dynamic. Matter of fact, their passing game was the weakest part of their offense. This year, when they needed him the most, we talk about Michael Pittman, we talk about when they need the big play, they go to the game breaker. Menashe Bailey was that guy. And not only just in, 3rd downs or, 2nd and long, let's go to Menashe Bailey, but in the biggest games. his Army game is what really put him on the map nationally. Scouts were flocking to Morgan State after that game because that game juxtaposed to what he did earlier in the year against James Madison. So now he stacked back-to-back big games against bigger opponents. James Madison played the national championship game. Army's defense has a really good cornerback prospect in Elijah Riley, who I think is a really good slot corner. But you look at what Bailey did, in those games, it was outstanding. And now that he was the focal point of every team's game plan, he still went out the rest of the year and balled out. Following that up with a really good week down the Tropical Bowl, where you're playing against FBS corners, guys that are going to be good. Stantley, Oliver Thomas, who went from the Tropical Bowl to Shrine Bowl. So he was out there. Chris Claybrooks, who played well at Memphis as a corner, he was out there. And you look at Bailey going up against the top competition, they couldn't cover him. And he plays fast in all directions. I think he's he can play inside as a slot or as a flanker. Plus he returns kicks. He plays on special teams. So he's going to be an impact player, I believe, very early.
Now, some of these guys who's going to be taking high, like a Judy or a CeeDee Lamb or a Ruggs, they're going to be expected to be the number one guy from day one on their teams for the most part. Now, you have Judy under the slot receiver rankings. Is he going to excel on the outside as well?
I think he can, but you look at it starting him out inside. I wish all receivers can start out inside, get their feet wet a little bit before they, can grow into the outside role, handling the rigors of playing that role at the NFL level. So I think Judy, because he can play inside, because I think he will be an inside guy, probably will have the easier transition than everybody else because he's playing that role, which is so specific. And I think as he gets older, he can grow into an outside role because of what he can do on the inside. So I think he has the upside. He's explosive. He's elusive. He is outstanding.
Now, of all your wide receiver rankings, who is the one guy maybe towards the bottom of the list who you think is going to surprise everybody and make a roster spot and make an impact?
It's funny. You look at the latter part of those flanker rankings, Dan Chisena out of Penn State. He is a guy that ran track at Penn State.
So you got the burners.
Got the burners. Barely played football outside of the last couple of years. Barely played football, but he was a guy that had a really good Tropical Bowl. MVP, in fact. And all he does is catch deep balls. So he's a special teamer. He's a fast guy. And he's also a guy that I think will make an impact special teams wise, but they'll find a way to get him into the offense. But I appreciate you doing a great job of critiquing my list. Hopefully I kept you quiet, so I did a pretty good job of shutting you up. So that's going to be it for this week's edition of Scout Team. I'm Emory Hunt, the Czar of the Playbook, for Troy Anthony, for Alex Marinoni, who's not here to debate you and go back and forth with my list, but Dave Hasshagen as well. Be sure to follow me on all of my social media accounts. Follow Troy as well at Football Fandom. Also, keep it locked here on the Game Plus Network for Friday's XFL Game Day show, where Troy Anthony, myself, Scott Churchson, Alex Marinoni will break down the upcoming weekend of XFL, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Check your cable provider for channel listings and subscribe on iTunes to Football Game Plan Podcast. We can find our Scout Team podcast.